Thank you everyone for joining us today. We will begin in just a few minutes to allow people to enter the room before we get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the launch event Human Rights Due Diligence Training Facilitation Guide. My name is Alex and I will be your technical facilitator for today's event. For assistance, please use the chat function to message anyone with the title Technical Facilitator, TF, in their name. Before we get started, I have a few technical notes to explain. If you would like to contribute to a perspective, an idea, or a thought, please use the chat function. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. You can find both of these features at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that this session will be recorded for documentation purposes. We are also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube to enable a larger audience to take part in this discussion. For those of you who are just joining us right now, thank you for attending the launch event Human Rights Due Diligence Training Facilitation Guide. I will now pass the floor to Mr. Sean Lees, UNDP Business and Human Rights Specialist at the Bangkok Regional Hub. Mr. Sean Lees, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Sean Lees and I'm a Business and Human Rights Specialist at UNDP Asia Pacific. Alongside our partners at the European Union, I have the distinct pleasure of hosting today's launch event and introducing UNDP's Human Rights Due Diligence Training Facilitation Guide. I will be providing an overview of the guide shortly, but allow me to first introduce our agenda and our panel. May I have the first slide, please?
It should be coming up shortly, Sean.
Noted. Oops. Yep, there we go. As you can see here, our event is split into two parts. The first part of the agenda is really going to focus on human rights due diligence policy at country, regional, and international levels. And then part two is going to be talking about human rights due diligence in practice. To help us understand the direction of travel for human rights due diligence policy, we are joined today by resident representative from UNDP Malaysia, Mr. Niloy Banerjee. Following Niloy, we'll have some words from Senior Advisor on Trade Issues at the European External Action Service, Mr. Gus Houghton. And then from the Multilateral Trade and Sustainable Development section at DG Trade European Commission, we will have Ricard Noorduman. During part two of our panel, we will be joined by Amanda Murphy of Council, Clifford Chance, and Kunetitorn Praditsarn, Senior Vice President at CP Group and Deputy Secretary General for Global Compact Network Thailand. After our panel discussion, we'll have Mianti Paras from our Sri Lanka office take us through the Human Rights Self-Assessment Training Tool and take some questions as well. If there's time, we'll have some summary remarks and some updates on things to come from our Global Advisor on Business and Human Rights, Mr. Livio Sarandrea. Now, the Human Rights Training Facilitation Guide was 2 years in the making and involved the support of many different people. Allow me to thank our partners at the European Union, of course, but also at Clifford Chance for their pro bono support to the Human Rights Self-Assessment Training Tool, and also to Global Compact Network Thailand for piloting human rights due diligence with UNDP, with the Securities Exchange Commission Thailand, the Stock Exchange Thailand, and the Ministry of Justice. They've been indispensable partners in getting, all of these people have been indispensable in getting this training guide and the training tool up and running today. I'd also like to thank our expert review committee, made up of Tulika Bansal from Danish Institute for Human Rights, Sibel Baumgartner from Focusrite, Vanessa Zimmerman and Shamista Selvatratnam from Pillar 2, and Rishi Shir Singh, an independent consultant and advisor to GBI. Last but not least, to Mr. Kevin Lehman, our business and human rights analyst at UNDP. Allow me to turn to the training guide itself. Can I have the second slide, please? Now, this training guide, which will be officially launched at the end of our panel, will provide an important contribution for the uptake and the advancement of the business and human rights agenda in Asia. How can a training guide have that impact? Well, first, you will have noted, as either specialists or people interested in this area, that there are very few training resources available online. And this fact slows down the process of raising awareness in a region like Asia, where the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are relatively new. So this free guide is built to increase the scale, the number of business professionals that understand human rights due diligence. It will help demystify human rights due diligence for people working with all size businesses, but especially SMEs that cannot afford the very helpful, very valuable, but still very expensive services of management consultancy firms and other experts. So another reflection I'd like to make as we go through the guide is that many companies in Asia, or at least business leaders I speak to, they are sometimes confused or express confusion at least over the proliferation of guidance that's available, and particularly around responsible business, human rights, climate change, women's rights, children's rights. And they find that sometimes it's difficult to know which to follow and even how to implement. For this, I have two responses. And the first is this. UN guiding principles is widely considered the world's most authoritative normative framework guiding human rights due diligence available today. And so really, the many different other forms of guidance, they all come back to this one source. This is the beginning, the 2011 endorsement of the Human Rights Council of the UN guiding principles. So we do have that at the center of our training. We're focused really on the basics. And the second response, for those who feel confused or unsure how to begin, that's exactly why we have the training facilitation guide. You can use the guide to conduct trainings yourself, or just to learn how to make the first steps, how to make the first or the four steps, in fact. The 4 steps to identify your human rights risks, to act on them, to track and understand whether your actions have made a difference, and 4th, to communicate the results of your work. Let's go to the next slide, please, and detail some features of the training. Now you'll see that first, on the left or right side, I don't know which way to point, but on the left side of your screen, you'll see that the training guide has a very simple approach, a step-by-step approach to how the training should proceed. This fact is, it's very common to all training guides. There's nothing new and innovative about the training guide. It's something we've seen before, and that familiarity we hope will allow for the easy absorption of the material. But the thing that is very different about this training guide is the many quizzes and online interactive tools that a trainee can enjoy and better absorb the information in an online setting. This training was drafted after all during COVID-19 lockdown period. And so we thought, let us not refer back to big groups of people with flip charts and colored pencils and all that. What can be done online? And you'll see many different quizzes in the training guide that we've developed. And third thing, on the far right of your screen is just a simple example of many illustrations that are provided in the guide. And we encourage people to cut and paste the illustrations they find most helpful and put in their slide decks as they do trainings. Please use the guide as robustly as you see fit. We're hoping that those illustrations, investments we've made there, provide for more dynamic trainings. Let's go to the table of contents. You'll note here, from our table of contents, that the training is divided into 2 parts. The first part covers the UN guiding principles, pillars 1, 2, and 3. And then the second part will detail human rights due diligence in more detail. in a much more complete and thorough manner. So the first part is just on the UN Guiding Principles, the first 3 pillars. And this could be helpful because sometimes you need to just start a conversation about the guiding principles, and there isn't that appetite for the detail and getting into the weeds on human rights due diligence. So this first part can be done to do an 1.5 hour or 3-hour training. Both part 1 and part 2 can be done over a 2-week period, as a Global Compact Network Thailand recently undertook. The other thing I want to say about part 1 before moving on is that we took time to give a little background on what human rights are. We find that business people in particular don't have a firm grip on what the human rights are implicated in business operations. We also spent some time drawing a difference between CSR, what is considered CSR in contemporary society, and business in human rights. So you'll find, I think, that segment rather interesting and fun area which to deploy. Let's move to the second slide, please, or the next slide. Now, this is part 2. This is really the meat of the training. You'll note here there's some replication with part 1 because you should be able to take part 1 separately or do both part 1 and 2 together. Regardless, there is some redundancy, and that's built in on purpose. But if I were to point your attention to module 2, you'll see that we have here the 4 steps: identifying, integrating, tracking, and communicating. But we spent a little bit more time on identifying and assessing human rights risks. One reason for this is that we have found that many companies have difficulty prioritizing the many risks they can identify in their operations. The issues of scale, scope, irremediability, and likelihood need a little bit of time and attention. And it's not a great feeling to getting off the start of a training and already feeling complicated and feeling like you're stuck, that your trainees are stuck in some confusion over these 4 terms. So, and for this reason, well, we'll have some words from Yanti, but I'll bring that up later. Indeed, we have built a tool. We have built a tool for trainers to help audiences to make identifying and assessing human rights risks more straightforward. Thank you for that slide. And we're going to demonstrate this tool at the end of today's session with the help of Nyati, again, in Sri Lanka. Now, regardless of the challenges, and there's no doubt that there's more focus from consumers, investors, and regulators on human rights in global supply chains than ever before. And the direction of travel is very, very clear. Indeed, even yesterday, during the European Union's State of the Union address, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated that, quote, "We will propose a ban on products on our market that have been made with forced labor because human rights are not for sale at any price." Secondly, of course, there's a highly anticipated proposed directive on mandatory human rights due diligence. This is something we're expecting to land any moment now, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps in a few weeks, perhaps next month. But this is perhaps, in the words of some people, a watershed moment for responsible business, the responsible business practice area. We're looking very much forward to seeing that. Lastly, but not least, there's been some trade action recently, particularly in Southeast Asia and in Malaysia in particular, with the US banning imports of some very critical items into its market. So we're going to better understand the implications of all of these developments to continued trade and investment between the EU and Asia and elsewhere with our discussion today, with our panel today. And I'm happy to introduce our resident representative, UNDP Malaysia, Niloy Banerjee. Welcome, Niloy.
Thank you, Sean. Good to be here.
Niloy, in Malaysia of late, questions have been raised about the levels of forced labor in critical industries there, critical to the COVID-19 response even. What responses have been coming from the government and from business with regards to forced labor risks there? And has there been uptake in interest in human rights due diligence in the last weeks and months?
All right. Thank you, Sean. Thank you. And thank you for this great initiative and congratulations on the launch. Look, let me split that maybe into 2 parts. One is the action that's happening because of exogenous pressure from outside of Malaysia. And part of what is happening inside of Malaysia, the internal energy that's building up. Because the exogenous part is important here because it's a very open economy. It's the second most open economy in the region, where trade accounts for 73% of the GDP. So it has to take notice of what's happening in the outside world. So yes, there's been forced labor issues, particularly in rubber and palm oil, both of which are large exports from Malaysia. As you know, Malaysia is the largest exporter of rubber gloves. So it has been very involved also in the COVID response. But the State Department's 2021 Trafficking in Persons report has downgraded Malaysia to what is called a Tier 3 country for not having minimal labor standards. Second, another issue that has come in is what you referred to earlier, Sean, the US ban, the Customs and Border Protection ban on imports of products made with forced labor or unfair labor practices. So Top Glove, which is our biggest glove making company, and WRP, these companies businesses have responded to this by certainly going into large scale reimbursement programs to labor who have been not fairly paid or have been trafficked by agents paying very high fees, and of course who live in very poor working conditions, working and living conditions. So some remedy payment is happening using technical expertise from our sister UN agency, ILO. And of course, the Human Rights Due Diligence process, therefore, is gaining traction in the business community. Now, endogenously, what's happening in Malaysia is the policy climate is changing very slowly. There is no consensus in the political class about the importance of this issue. But again, as you referred, the European ban announcement yesterday, possible ban, is going to be another fillip to this campaign. But the Ministry of Human Resources is the body that really leads this process here. It's first instituted a nice app to collect complaints from migrant workers. That's already a big step because there was no voice for migrant workers yet, other than CSOs and the National Human Rights Institution. They're also working on a national response plan, the ministry. And finally, there's a special committee to study labor trafficking, which also works closely with the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is sort of the more policing and security agency of the country. There is a national action plan that's on anti-trafficking in persons that's been launched. There is also some talk of reviewing legislation. At least there's a commitment to review legislation. The Employment Act of 1955, the Minimum Standards of Housing, Accommodation and Amenities Act of 1990. So there's some good momentum there. And final piece on this is what UNDP is doing with the Human Rights Commission and the Ministry of Law, which is under the Prime Minister's office here, along with, of course, our partners in the EU, is that we are working towards a national action plan. And to that end, the ministry has already constituted a committee, a national steering committee, which is now kind of driving that. UNDP is also doing its part in the advocacy, putting out quite a bit of literature, raising awareness, and this guide, the due diligence guide, will be a huge addition to that. We are also having next week, actually, the government is hosting the National Conference on Business and Human Rights. So there's a bit of momentum building here, but there's some ways to go, Sean. We cannot overstate the importance of this in Malaysia. The agenda is too important, and a lot more needs to be done. And multi-stakeholder partnerships have to be created. I'm sorry to repeat the cliche, but because labor needs a safe space where abuses just cannot occur, zero tolerance zone. And so training and due diligence and capacity building is absolutely key here. So I'll leave it at that, Sean. We'll hear from other speakers, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Niloy. Your reputation for speaking eloquently and at length, of course, precedes you. But your today very pithy remarks there, and I take a lot from the understanding that Malaysia is going through a political valley at this time, and so the getting a consensus politically about the right policy that's needed is difficult. You said the policy climate is changing slowly, but perhaps these external events are going to advance it at a quicker pace going forward. And of course, that would happen with developments outside the region. For example, the EU, which is a big buyer of the many commodities and products from Malaysia. So thank you for your comments, Niloy, and we'll take it to the EU now. So our next speaker is Mr. Gus Hoyten, the Senior Advisor on Trade Issues for the European External Action Service. Welcome, Mr. Hoyten. As you
thank you, Sean. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you indeed from Niloy for his good introduction. Also, with I think a highly relevant remark that there is indeed no consensus at the political level about how important these issues perhaps not are, and the need to react appropriately. First of all, I like on the guide. I like the logo. I think they're called. I see a lot of contour lines on the logo. I'm not sure if you did it on purpose. Let's hope we can at some point contribute to having much more lows than highs in the contour lines. I'll be very, very brief. First of all, I've been involved, most of you may not know that, but I've been involved since the early days of the minerals regulation. I also chair the work of the OECD, the multi-stakeholder group, industry, civil society, governments, OECD, Great Lakes, and wider UN framework on the work on the minerals. So excuse me if I sometimes become a bit too technical and refer to minerals. I think our experience, just to give you one thing, which comes from a presentation which one of the OECD colleagues recently did to the Committee on the Democratic Republic of Congo of the Security Council, and he mentioned the economic importance of due diligence. If due diligence at the end of the day, of course, will not solve everything, we know that, but just an illustration, illegal exports of gold, which may end up in criminal, in semi-military hands, and directly or indirectly contribute to serious human rights, but also environmental violation. 5% of global gold production, mostly artisanal and small-scale mining, is exported illegally, meaning $9 billion per year. And just to start on some of the lessons learned from our EU regulation, which was adopted already in 2017 and entered into full. It's the first real hard due diligence, mandatory human rights due diligence act that was adopted by the European Union, and it has entered into full application, meaning obligations for companies, for importers, only on the 1st of January 2021, which means we're looking now at very close to 9 months of application only. And we're learning indeed still with that regulation. What is important whenever we talk about human rights due diligence, environment due diligence in the future, that we look at the impact on the ground. Not only what's the impact on companies, on economic operators, on importers, but at the end of the day, and I think that was those were of course John Ruggie's ideas. We're looking to improve the situation in all parts of the supply chain, but of course notably upstream. One issue we have not, none of the, I think, governments involved in these exercises have come to a full understanding. Analysis is ongoing by the OECD. What are the real impacts on the ground, the monitoring and evaluation? Working hard on that, and we're aiming for results rather soon on that. The cost and the value of due diligence. We need to make sure that whatever kind of human rights due diligence, environmental due diligence we have, the cost does not end up in the weakest parts of the supply chain, frequently in developing countries. Because well, a nanogram of tin in your mobile phone will not change the world for a large producer of mobile phones. It will change. It will be an important cost element, especially if you do complicated tracking and tracing. If you're an artisanal miner or a small commerçant, as they have in the DRC. I referred to it earlier, and it's also in human rights due diligence. It's one part of a much more complicated system. Industry involvement, industry schemes, industry due diligence, legislation requiring putting up mandatory due diligence is not enough, because company uptake will also depend on good governance in the widest sense. That's good governance in sourcing countries, it's good governance at customs officials level whenever applicable. It's also good governance in producing and consuming countries. Well, then rapidly to the Sustainable Corporate Government Initiative. I think the first announcements already last year by Commissioner Reinders. Commissioner Breton has now joined the initiative officially, so it's a joint initiative by Commissioner Reinders, DG Just, and Commissioner Breton, so-called DG GROW, which is the DG in the Commission responsible for enterprises. Well, you may interpret that as a watchdog function. I think it's wrong. It's only to make sure that whatever we do is implementable at a company level, and that can be effectively implemented and effectively also supervised and analyzed and followed up by national authorities and by the Commission. What is important in this legislation, although we already have the minerals regulation, is that for the first time comprehensive human rights and environmental mandatory due diligence, plus of course directors' duties and wider corporate governance. People tend to forget that second part of the proposal. Well, I can't tell you much other than it will be adopted before the end of this year. That is the latest information I have. You may or may not have seen legislative developments in France. I think it's now already close to 4 years to have their legislation. There is the recent German law, and what at least also we hear from public sources, because there's no official line on this one yet, is that it will have a considerable coverage of the supply chain. I'll be very fast now on this. I see Sean popping up. What we hear from third sources, so not an EU position, mandatory cross-sectoral. All companies, including small and medium-sized enterprises, EU companies, and also companies doing business in the EU, although they're established outside. Well, of course, we're seeing increasingly our calls for liability. All that is still to be defined, whether it's administrative liability, private liability, even criminal liability, all kinds of very complicated legal issues, proportionate nature. And of course, with rules for third countries. I'm slightly puzzled when I read that on expert websites such as CSR Europe, rules for third countries. Somewhat unclear. I think they may mean the impact on the upstream operators in third countries. And that'll be my last remark. This legislation is developed as a company law, internal market legislation. What is important for us to keep in mind that we also do the right accompanying measures in our development policy, in our outreach, in promoting sustainable development, responsible supply chain, in third countries, because this, of course, is not new that we deal with human rights risks and environmental risks in supply chain. It is, however, in terms of legislative efforts, a bit of a quantum leap, I would say. I'll end there, Sean, before you kick me out.
Thank you so much, Gus. I mean, leaving it with that idea that it's a quantum leap, but indeed it is company law that we're talking about, company legislation that we are talking about is very important. Because my question to you and then also to Ricard is coming up is, will the mandatory human rights due diligence, which you've articulated so well for us, twists and turns it might be taking, sharing between commissioners, for example, will it actually impact on EU trade policy and in fact the nature or the approach of trade negotiations? I think you've even asked this at one of our steering committees on our project. That will it have an impact on the approach that the EU takes to countries in Asia when it comes to negotiating or renegotiating free trade agreements?
Well, thank you, Sean. And of course, that is the last part is in particular relevant for Ricard, but he will no doubt mention that in all our modern trade agreements, there is a chapter on trade and sustainable development. There are provisions on responsible business conduct, which I personally prefer to CSR, which has become in many countries synonymous for corporate whitewashing. So I rather refer to responsible business conduct, a wider concept. So that will be part and parcel of our engagement. I don't see this as a major departure from our trade policy. As you read, of course, in our most recent publication, Trade Policy Review, it's both an open policy, a resilient trade policy, but also a responsible trade policy. And to call a spade a spade, the responsible part is also a level playing field argument as well. There's no need to compete with countries that do serious human rights violations. Call it human rights dumping if you want to, labor law dumping, or in the future, and some people have referred to that as also part of the new human rights, environmental dumping. So again, I don't see this as a major departure. It is, and the impacts also are on companies. They will not lead to new, let's say, barriers behind the border, called as technical barriers to trade. We're seeing that with the experience also with the minerals regulation. Simply, if you're an importer of material above a certain threshold, not sure that is the directive route, but you will simply have to do enhanced due diligence if you import from conflict affected and high risk areas. It's basically, well, all those having dealt with company, know your customer, but also know your supplier, is now taking, due diligence takes the know your supplier, I think, to a more operational level. And we've seen that in the audits we're currently doing, at least not this person himself, but which our consultant is doing for the minerals regulation supply scheme equivalence assessment, that auditors also need to be trained. They have to look further, and training, they're good auditors, but auditors don't always realize you have to look further than commercial risks, but look at human rights and labor law risks, and indeed mitigation and avoiding and mitigating harm. And in that one point, which you of course could not deal with extensively in your guide, in your training document, of course, there will be liability elements, but my experience also as a legal advisor to the Council of Ministers in a previous life is that the liability part will be one of the harder parts of the directive to be discussed by Parliament and by the Council.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much for your robust remarks. I try to do them justice by summarizing the more interesting ones for me personally, but I want to also make sure we have enough time for our next speaker. Thank you so much, Gus. We'll be back in touch perhaps at the question and answer period.
Thank you, Sean.
Cheers. Now on to Ricard Noorderman. He's the policy officer for the Multilateral Trade and Sustainable Development Policy section of DG Trade, European Commission. Welcome, Ricard. How are you?
Thank you, Sean. I'm very well. I hope you're as well. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very happy to be on this. As in Brussels, we would call this a manel, but despite this fact, I'm very happy to be here.
It's a manel so far, but it's going to change quickly. We're going to
yeah.
Okay. But let's start with that last question that I put to Gus. Is it mandatory human rights due diligence going to have any impact on the direction of trade policy or implicate trade negotiations in some way, whether a country actually takes on board human rights due diligence with its own legislation or not? Will it make any difference, or will this be just behind the scenes companies taking on new compliance and or new processes with regards to their corporate responsibilities?
It's a very good question. Let me answer it by explaining a little bit how we have done up until this point. So from a trade policy perspective, we have had TSD chapters, so trade and sustainable development chapters. I think the first one was 2011, and since then every free trade agreement that the EU has signed, or as it was mentioned, under the general system of preferences, we also have parts on this. And what we have done so far is that we have been referencing existing international agreements. So it's the main ones that we all know. It's the OECD M&E guidelines. It's the ILO tripartite declaration, the UN guiding principle, for example. So this has been the approach so far. And I think in general, not only on when it comes to these issues, but in general, we are very keen to base whatever we do in terms of regulatory cooperation on international standards. But that said, there is also this idea or this perception of EU as one of our strongest characteristics is that we have a regulatory cloud, so to say. I mean, we all know that, for example, on data protection, is a common used example that the EU adopted something that then is being applied by industry also outside Europe. So this might be, if once this legislation is in place, once it's starting to be implemented, you might see this kind of effect. But I wouldn't expect it to maybe be directly referenced. But that might also depending on which is the trading partner are we talking about and so forth. What is the relevant of their exports and so forth. So it's a little bit tailor-made. I mean, in some of our trading partners, for example, the mineral sector that Gus mentioned might be more important than the others. There might be more of an agricultural exchange. So it's a little bit ad hoc, but I don't expect this to be directly referenced anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions I wanted to put to Gus, but I ran out of time, and because I don't want to belabor the trade policy part so much, but there was that period, especially in the 90s, when there's this consensus that trade issues were divorced from human rights issues, that we should divorce them from environmental issues, and we're eager to put things on fast track through parliaments and other legislative bodies. Can you say, on the basis of, or from where you're sitting, and the basis of the EC president's recent proposal for an import ban and mandatory human rights due diligence, etc., are those days where trade policy was divorced from human rights, are they behind us? Are they buried in the past? Is this a new day? Is this a new chapter? Or as you said earlier, we're going to be working on these kind of issues on an ad hoc basis, and a country-to-country basis, or region-to-country basis? Is it going to continue being messy or unclear or baby steps, or have we really turned the page with regards to trade policies, incorporation, or appetite for these other complex conversations?
Very interesting question. I think we have turned the page, definitely. I mean, to clarify what I said about ad hoc, I think just to say that depending on the partner country, I mean, the baseline should always be the same, but then you might want to focus on specific sectors between specific trading partners. But I think not only human rights, but also we talk about sustainability a lot, where we also include climate and biodiversity within a wider environmental umbrella. And I think, politically, you won't be able to pass anything now without a strong element on human rights and climate. That's the political context we're in at the moment in the EU. And I think there's two parts of this kind of why this is. One, I think it's a morality argument almost. There is something that is morally wrong, and we have to address this. But there's also embedded in this, there is also this competitiveness argument that is underlying, I would say, saying that if a trading partner can produce a good with using forced labor, that is, basically using slave labor, that's a competitive advantage. So there's like these two elements that feed this, and I think. And I mean, as Jose mentioned, we have this ongoing review of our TSD chapter, how we're going to beef them up in the future. There's NGOs are asking us since a long time to kind of link compliance with trade and sustainable development to tariff preferences. There's a lot of ideas to how to reinforce this. We will see what comes out of it. But the page has turned, at least in the in the Brussels policy context, for sure.
Fantastic. For me, it almost feels historic just to hear somebody sitting where you are to say that page has turned. And indeed, if we're to go back to Gus's comments, he remarks the 2017, conflict minerals due diligence legislation being the first hard test. So, I think he might have said the pages have been turning. But regardless, it's nice to know that we're in a new space, and the arguments that the old arguments of the 90s are now behind us. We still have some more time, Ricardo. I hope you don't mind me asking a couple questions, or maybe just one, on the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. There you have one of the most progressive trade policies ever written. And I know that it's very little time on the implementation of that trade and sustainability chapter. But are there any early lessons to be learned, implementation of that, and/or in the lead up, in fact, to the passage, the ratification of that agreement?
Yes, I mean, with the caveat that I'm not following Vietnam specifically, but yeah. Of course I have a little bit of a view on it. I would say that this kind of agreement it's going to be a stepping stone for future. If you look at the TSD chapter, when it comes to multilateral environmental agreements, when it comes to multilateral labor standards, this is something I think will, Mr. West said, as a template for future agreement. And I think what we have learned here is, as Hus mentioned, that sometimes we talk about the smart mix. It's not only about proposing mandatory legislation. It's not only about signing trade agreements. It's also about implementation and how to. I mean, we talk a lot about awareness raising and capacity building in this sense. And if in the case of Vietnam, a lot of the focus so far has been on ratifying and implementing fundamental ILO conventions. So I think, if we want to base mandatory due diligence on basically on fundamental labor rights, we cannot only say to companies, please do your part. We also have to kind of ensure that the fundamental framework is supportive of that. So you cannot ask a company to apply an ILO convention in a country which hasn't ratified an ILO convention, for example. I think that doesn't really work. So you have to work on these two tracks. It's not only about passing the ball to the business and saying, it's up to you. We as a policymaker and as a civil servant also have the role to accompany whatever business sector are doing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ricardo, for these comments. And I hope you'll stick around for a question and answer period, which I know there'll be several to you. Now, this would conclude the first part of our panel on human rights due diligence. I forgot what it was for a moment there. And some big themes have been shared. And I know I won't do any justice to doing a summary, but indeed, we started with Niloy, who said at the country level, in some Asian countries, the local politics matter and how much they can take up human rights due diligence. It doesn't really matter how much external influence there is. It doesn't matter how much external pressure there is. It will help get us in the right direction, but national dynamics matter a lot. And this is not to say that, for example, the country of Malaysia is not doing a lot. In fact, they are working right now on a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. They've been working on it for some time. There's a national conference coming up on September 21st and 22nd, I believe. And the country office is working closely with the Malaysian government and getting the right people on in that meeting. The second thing from Gus that I really took away was that one of the things that I took away was we don't want the cost and value of the cost implications, if there is any, the cost implications of conducting due diligence, human rights due diligence, and environmental due diligence to be borne primarily or even only by upstream providers, people in the developing world. We don't want suddenly companies to say, well, the risks are too high there, we're just not going to work there anymore. So because that means the impact, our intentions would be thwarted. It would be the rule of unintended consequences taking hold. So we'll be more mindful of that in the future. I did want to ask him if he spoke to Commissioner Reinders or Reinland recently to see when that directive would in fact be submitted to Parliament. I forgot to ask. Perhaps he'll give us the answer in the chat box or give us a hint over the course of our day today. Last but not least, Ricard, telling us we've turned the page. I'm going to quote you on that. I'm going to tweet it and everything else, because there are still some trade professionals that I speak to who are still firmly in the camp of trade should never have any other, should not be overly influenced, certainly, by human rights and environmental considerations. In fact, one trade specialist I know said these are the new non-tariff trade barriers to free trade that will just lead to lesser prosperity in years to come. So we got to, I still think we have some people to convince, but it's nice to know that people working on these issues directly at the EU believe otherwise. Now, moving on to our second half of the panel, very, very grateful to introduce Amanda Murphy of counsel at Clifford Chance, based there in Perth. Clifford Chance has done an enormous amount of pro bono work with us to get our human rights self-assessment training tool fully populated with 99 human rights risks that are common to a variety of industries that do business in Asia. Now, Amanda, welcome. First, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Sean. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here at the launch. Really excited.
Now, I understand, among other things, you advise multinational companies on their human rights risks and their human rights policy frameworks. Let me ask you just straight up front, what's their appetite for human rights due diligence? How would you describe the interest in human rights due diligence in the markets that you're working in?
Well, I guess, really what we can see is, I've worked in this sort of area for quite a long time, and particularly being in WA in the energy resources sector, a lot of the time in the past it was difficult to bring these sorts of attentions to companies, to their attention, to the board level where real action was going to be taken. But certainly in the last couple of years, we see a real increased focus on the need for human rights due diligence and human rights risk generally as a broader potential reputational risk and risk to the company. So I guess there were two, from a practice perspective, areas where we do see this trend, and why I think this trend is going to be increasing over time. So the first really relates to the legal developments that have been happening, and that the policy developments which some of the earlier panelists were discussing. So particularly in Europe, European jurisdictions, with particularly issue-specific requirements for reporting, and issue-specific due diligence relating more to modern slavery and forced labor-related due diligence. The regulatory landscape is changing quite a bit. And this really means that other companies, if they're to engage with, in cross-border transactions with companies who are headquartered in those jurisdictions, they're essentially indirectly forced to comply to some extent to meet those requirements as well. So what we see a lot of now is from lawyers acting on both sides to transactions, is that they're essentially revising their contracts with their business partners to include express warranties relating to compliance with human rights, and in some instances also termination rights. So rights to terminate a contract where there has not been human rights due diligence undertaken, or if there's an adverse human rights impact found. So we anticipate that really the contractual provisions that are being influenced by the legal requirements in certain jurisdictions are flowing through to the contractual level, and that's then flowing through to counterparties or throughout the world, through other regions in the world. So not limited to certainly the home jurisdiction of where the legal requirements are being developed. So we think that this will drive an increased uptake of human rights due diligence over time. The second, I guess, major factor we're seeing where there's been an increased focus on human rights due diligence, and where the practices and procedures of conducting a proper human rights due diligence process have been enhanced, is in the context of corporate transactions. So interestingly now, when we do a transactional due diligence, there is often, in the most recent ones, there's always been an element of conducting a human rights aspect to that corporate transaction. So whether it be in the context of an acquisition or a joint venture, we're seeing that the target company or the JV partner is being subjected to questions and a due diligence process relating to their human rights compliance record. So really lawyers, advisors, consultants do need to be able to identify potentially high-risk transactions when conducting a due diligence, and asking, whether the extent of human rights due diligence is required, what extent is required in the context of that transaction. And the sorts of questions that we will ask, and that other advisors and lawyers should ask, are relating to for instance, the location risk of the business that you're acquiring or entering. Is it located in a higher risk operating context? So is it in a conflict affected region? Is there potentially weaker governance or corruption issues associated in the jurisdiction? Advisors should also be asking whether the target's business partners are involved in high risk business activities. So in certain sectors and industries, there are heightened potential risks. So particularly where they require, for instance, land acquisition, resettlements, extensive water usage, as in some energy resources, mining industries, reliance on security personnel and seasonal labour. And also where there's extensive data usage involved in the business. So all those kind of factors are something which, when you're conducting a normal corporate due diligence, should trigger the advisors now to consider we need to do a human rights due diligence. And I guess finally, they should be looking at also who the business partners are of the target company or the joint venture. It could involve, if there's a partnership with a state-owned entity, for instance, or a government entity, is there a history of violations or potential violations being conducted in relation to that region? So I guess by identifying the human rights risks and transactions, human rights due diligence is becoming a key component of transactional due diligence, and that's what we're seeing in the APAC region and beyond. But I should note that human rights due diligence is distinguishable, obviously, from an ordinary or other aspects of a corporate due diligence. And this is because the process for a human rights due diligence focuses on, as we've mentioned, the impacts to human rights, which means that the risks to the business are in some respects kind of a secondary importance. But that doesn't mean that the focus should not be on how the human right risk and non-compliance with that risk could impact the business. We also see that in transactions that human rights due diligence should not just be a one-off exercise. It needs to be an ongoing thing, a practice over time. But by starting to undertake these more involved human rights due diligence processes in the context of transactions, we're really seeing the skills being uptaken and more training being conducted within companies as well, which is really increasing, I think, the aspect and understanding of what's involved in human rights due diligence in companies. So I guess to summarize, it's really the cross-border nature of international trade and commerce for companies operating in APAC. The reach of the laws and potential upcoming further regulations are going to extend well beyond those jurisdictions in the US and Europe, and I think that will really increase the uptake of human rights due diligence in the APAC region as well.
Fantastic, Amanda. I mean, this is some of the most exciting part of the panel so far. I mean, to hear from a lawyer who advises large companies, as we have there in Australia, but also others that are working in the region, that human rights due diligence becoming a key component of transactional due diligence. It's very exciting. It means that the message is getting out. And there's a part of me that just wants to know exactly how many companies are actually asking these questions about the human rights profile of a business partner or in a merger and acquisition, because those kinds of numbers are a very good reflection of the uptake of the business and human rights throughout the region. You've hit many points here. You've gone through the trends. You bifurcated that into two focus areas. of course, I only seized on the second bit, but indeed knowing that that the focus is going to issue-specific areas and specific areas, especially around forced labor. We also saw recently in Australia some, I think, I'm sorry if I'm not apprised of everything happening in Asia Pacific, including Australasia, but I believe you have some forced labor legislation making its way through the Australian Senate. Have you been watching that space at all? And can you tell me about the appetite for that kind of legislation? Do you see this passing in the near future?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly in Australia, we've got a Modern Slavery Act. So that was introduced in 2018. So following the UK's legislation, we now have a Commonwealth legislation for modern slavery reporting, and it's actually a mandatory reporting system. And the first sort of 2 rounds of reporting has now occurred in accordance with that legislation. And there's been some really interesting analysis, and I think this, perhaps that's what we're seeing as well in the Australian region in our practice, that having this now a mandatory reporting legislative element to it has meant that businesses are forced to address it. Even though the Act doesn't have any penalties at this current stage in time, and it has been criticised for not having penalties, they're published on a public register, and there's been a lot of analysis done from various sort of industries and what people are reporting, what makes best practice on reporting on these sorts of things. And there was a report by Monash University. It was really interesting. They sort of went through and ranked out of the top performing 100 Australian companies what were the best statements and what were not, and that was splashed over the front page of the newspapers. What were the good companies and who were the bad companies? So in terms of driving, if people were unsure about the need to focus on human rights risks and address them, it's definitely becoming clearer and clearer here. And the MSA, some of the findings I think were really interesting as well from the Monash University study. They said some of the best practice, so the best practice when it came to the statements and reporting, included statements which had a clear scoping of risks based on the materials, goods, services, and the location of suppliers and the assessment of risk level. And they also had substantial discussion of specific risks relevant to that business rather than general risks. And I think this is where really the human rights self-assessment tool, which you have developed at UNDP, is fantastic, because it's already identifying the top kind of risks for certain industries and identifying the level of risk associated with those. So particularly, for smaller companies where they don't have a lot of resources, they don't have a lot of time or perhaps employees to devote an entire sustainability team to addressing these issues, something like the tool is a fantastic starting point for them to really be able to identify that just starting with the key potential risks at that their business might face. And you can start to train the employees or the relevant people within the industry to so it becomes like a familiar step that they do as part of their everyday practice. And I think that's exactly what the tool is going to do. And we think certainly at Clifford Chance that that will really serve to enhance and promote human rights due diligence within the region.
That's fantastic. And of course, that human rights self-assessment training tool, which we're going to cover real soon here, could not have been done without the good work of your associates in your office under your leadership, Amanda. So thank you so very much. And the last thing I just want to touch on is because you did mention the MSA, the Modern Slavery Act in Australia. And of course, there was some disappointment in the beginning about the non-punitive nature of that legislation. But I remember speaking to experts like Vanessa Zimmerman at Pillar 2, who said, look, this is a start. It's focused really just on forced labor, but let's see where it goes. And for you to then tell me now, this is being like maybe a year or two ago since I spoke to Vanessa, that there's these rankings of the top 100 reports, and the reports, the best statements are making their ways into the newspapers. I think you might even said the front page of the newspapers. I don't know if you actually meant it. So much play that it's on the political agenda is for me proof positive that these initial steps, like a UK or Australian Modern Slavery Act, is the first part of the cycle, or rather of the launch towards something more concrete. And you are seeing it every day at your work at Clifford Chance and advising companies on how to manage their human rights risks. Thank you so very much, Amanda, for your insights today. Hugely valuable, alongside all our
pleasure. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you. Now, let's go back to where I'm sitting in Thailand. I have with me Kunetichorn Praditsan, a very old friend to UNDP through his role at Global Compact Network Thailand, and a huge supporter of getting the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights off the ground in Thailand. I can't say enough about the hard work that Netiton has done over the years, alongside UNDP and other partners that are based at the regional offices here. Netiton, welcome. How are you?
Good, great, thank you. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. You're a little on the quiet side, so if you may.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we'll hear you better. Yep, that's better.
Better? Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so Netiton, you have some of the largest and most important Thai companies on the Global Compact Network, Compact Network Thailand, many of which are also listed on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And I think Thailand is very proud of the fact that it has more companies, more Thai companies on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index than perhaps any other Southeast Asian country. Tell us if human rights due diligence is also being taken on board by these same companies or more companies. And what are some of the most promising developments, and what are some of the challenges that businesses are facing in Thailand
Okay, great.
Human rights due diligence?
Sure, of course. Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you for that kind introduction. I should also say that I'm privileged to enjoy our friendship and collaboration as well. So before I begin, likewise, I'd like to thank the UNDP and the European Union for your kind invitation for me to speak today. And in particular, it's been the privilege of Global Compact Network Thailand to collaborate with the UNDP regional team, you yourself, Kunchan, Livio, to promote the business and human rights subject in Thailand through multiple avenues. Please accept our sincere congratulations on the preparation and the launch of the HRDD training facilitation guide as well. So in response to your questions, Kunchan, I offer the following observations, which resonate with previous speakers. The first part has to do with the level of interest among Thai companies. In general, indeed, over the years, I have observed increasing positive response, readiness, and willingness for Thai companies at all levels and of all sizes to engage. This is due to a number of internal as well as external push and pull factors. Drivers and incentives are, for example, the domestic mandatory reporting for listed companies starting next year, which is external, the support from the highest political level, the Prime Minister himself, I should note, Thailand's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, awards and assessments, these are external, such as that of Ministry of Justice Award for Exemplary Business and Human Rights Performance, or Ongkon Tonbap in Thai, as well as the need to pay close attention to human rights management after the topic has become one of the main sustainability materiality issues for companies. The annual National Dialogue on Business and Human Rights this year will also focus on the mandatory human rights due diligence. In more advanced companies, reporting standards, corporate sustainability assessments, such as the JSI, as you mentioned, and S&P Corporate Sustainability Assessment, or CSA, and benchmarking are also important drivers. But lastly, Sean, don't forget the stakeholders' expectations from lenders, investors, consumers, the civil society, or even employees for the improved corporate human rights performance. I think now that we have managed to raise enthusiasm among the Thai business sector, not our pressure, but because of their genuine interest to do so, I do hope that our enthusiasm will feed well into such policy processes as Thailand-EU FTA's negotiations, the TIC reporting of the US, our UPR session at the Human Rights Council, among others. It's also my firm belief that the onus is now upon all of us to actually make human rights and its related corporate process as accessible and operationalizable as possible, considering the variety of capacity of these companies across the sectors. It now brings me to the second part of my comments here. From the experiences of our participants at the GSCNT Business and Human Rights Academy training, we observed that one, the most difficult part for their companies to comply with the UNGPs is the requirements to establish a number of right-based process and procedure, such as human rights due diligence, monitoring, rights-based grievance mechanism throughout the value chain. I emphasize the terms process and procedure here. The process involves multiple internal stakeholders to raise awareness among them, design and drive the human rights process forward, especially in a large multinational conglomerate like CP Group, where I sit. Over the next 2 years, we are undertaking our group-wide human rights due diligence in close to 50 business units in 14 business groups across 21 countries of our operations. I'm not saying that is an easy task. 2, managing human rights related thematic issues is also a big challenge. And many of the participants lack a clear picture of the entire scope of business and human rights. For example, the common understanding is that BHR is all about taking care of their employees. This understanding may influence companies to overlook human rights impact of their business on other stakeholder groups and rights holders. So to conclude on this part, I'd like to offer a number of further comments. Well, first of all, patience and understanding would be appreciated. It's clear that Thai companies, big or small, want to comply, want to be responsible, but it takes time. Second, we need a helping hand. Capacity building will be key success factor to get everyone on board. That is why it is clear that we need a guide like what you are launching today to help communicate the interpretation of the UNGPs and address these challenges. The guide that speaks to the private sector and communicate about the expected corporate process. I'm glad that the guide launched today will be an anchor for companies among the proliferation of guides and tools. Another aspect of the capacity building is the need to help businesses navigate through the material sustainability issues. How does the business and human rights conversation connect with other dots, such as the just transition under climate change and biodiversity, the global dialogue on inequality, corporate governance, amongst others? In short, we need to help facilitate and not unnecessarily or unintentionally add burden or confusion. My last 2 observations. Third, the right incentive structure is necessary. I've heard more than once from Thai businesses that their clients in the Western markets shifted to cheaper producers outside Thailand when our cost went up after an upgrade of the human rights standards in their operations. Apparently, the procurement team and the responsible sourcing team of our clients aren't coordinated as much as we had hoped for. Level playing field across nations will also be important, especially when we start observing more stringent human rights laws in the EU and elsewhere. We certainly want to witness a race to the top, not to the bottom, or human rights dumping as mentioned earlier. My last point, common measurement tools will become increasingly important as we need to track and report progress. That concludes the 2 sets of comments for this part. We'll be happy to elaborate more. Back to you, Captain Sean.
Wow, I knew you'd make some impressive comments, but these were, there was a little shock and awe in some of this, particularly at the end there. I just want to reiterate some of these points. Patience is needed in every market. Thai companies actually are really fast to adapt. And so I know that if Kun Netitorn is saying, these small, Thai companies, big and small, need some an adjustment to these new processes to understand how to go forward, and I believe it. And so I think there's that patience there. And luckily, any mandatory human rights due diligence that might be tabled in Europe is still, we still want to see the proposal that goes to Parliament. There will be probably, I've been told, like up to 18 months before the proposal, the directive actually takes effect. And that's not the only thing you're looking at, of course, out of Thailand, but it is one external force measure that we're mindful of. So patience, having building capacity. You said giving us a helping hand. The training facilitation guide is one small bit, but of course, more dialogue between regions, more dialogue between companies, business partners, and of course, business associations on the topic are required. And it really resonates to me that the reduction of confusion. There are, again, so many different kinds of initiatives happening under the heading responsible business. How do we connect the dots more clearly? I think there is some more attention by certainly multilateral organizations to make sure that we address that. And of course, your message on incentives, about the need to level the playing field, and why our program on business and human rights in Asia is trying to take a regional approach and level the playing field so that there isn't that first mover disadvantage to complying with international human rights standards to the extent that that's in existence. I'm not sure how are we doing on the time. Apologies. It looks like I still have a minute left. Kun Netitorn, tell me something about your experience with training companies on human rights due diligence. What was some feedback from a recent training you did with the many partners I listed earlier?
Yeah, well, if I may, Sean, Kun Sean, I'd like to mention a little bit about the GCNT Business and Human Rights Academy first, right? A little bit, just that that was born purely of a genuine partnership to establish a region-wide resource center, both training and knowledge management, or KM, on the subject, and also a safe space for the business to exchange views, yet a place to find multi-stakeholder collaboration as well. And we have enjoyed, and I have to say this, we have enjoyed and appreciated the partnership with the MOJ, UNDP, yourself, National Human Rights Commission, Stock Exchange Commission, and others since the beginning. So we hope to officially sign a multi-party MOU on the Academy towards the end of the year. So at this pilot course, back to your question, we expected to develop the curriculum focusing on the process in line with the requirements and expectations of the UNDPs. So your UNDP's training facilitation guide was our main reference material for structuring and instructional designing of the pilot course. So from our participants and from our own observations, the reflections of the content on the curriculum are 3 points. With the guide as our reference, we provided a clear and concise way to communicate what to do and how to do. So equally important, the what and the hows in each step of the HRDD and the overall corporate human rights management. So the guide also provided one of the good sources and references for companies to embed the human rights topic in their organization. Overall, it was beneficial for a business and human rights focal point at the corporate level, both to learn of the expected process for their own execution and for embedding business and human rights in the organization. So that's pretty much my brief set of observations. And in short, is a helpful tool for the private sector to interpret the UNDP's expectation, leading to execution, and provide a trusted source of reference for the capacity building in the area of business respecting human rights. So lastly, I just would welcome an opportunity to further explore ways to cooperate between Global Compact Network Thailand with both USI, the UNDP, and the European Union as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, indeed, we've had a rich second half of the panel there. I won't do a summary of both panel 1 and 2. You've been with us. I've seen the numbers stay pretty stable throughout our session today, between 330 and 370 people, at least on this platform. Of course, there's others on YouTube and Facebook as well. That's a significant number of people to come to a one-session launch event. And of course, that is also an indication of the high level of interest in the subject of human rights due diligence, and of course, and having a free training guide. And so without further ado, if I may have a drum roll, I'd like to ask our technical team to go ahead in the chat box and if they haven't already, put the URL for the training guide there so that everyone can access it if they haven't already through their own means. So let us announce that the Human Rights Due Diligence Training Facilitation Guide is officially launched as of this moment. And as I do things, I'm going to turn over now to my colleague Mianti in Sri Lanka, who's going to introduce the Human Rights Due Diligence Self-Assessment Training Tool. But as I do so, let me just say something about the tool. Very happy with the compliments and or the positioning of the tool that Amanda Murphy from Clifford Chance provided. One thing I'd like to also stress is that this is a training tool and it is the first iteration of it. It may grow wider. It may incorporate more risks. Right at this moment in time, it is there to help companies identify and prioritize. That is the main function. I've already spoken so much today. Allow me to simply turn it over to Mianti, who's going to take us through the tool and perhaps answer a couple questions about it. Mianti?
Thank you so much, Sean. So please allow me to share my screen. I hope it's visible to everyone now. So once you access the tool, you can see the URL on top. And this is the sort of first landing page you come to. You can see there are several tabs on the top. So the first one is about talks about what exactly the tool is about. It introduces the concept. So what is human rights due diligence? Very briefly, it's to help businesses and those sort of using the tool understand, prioritize, and take actions for their human rights risks. As you scroll down, you see the terms that are used across the tool. So it's important to sort of very briefly, I will touch on it. Scale talks about sort of the gravity or seriousness of the issue. When we talk about scope, what we actually mean is the number of people who are impacted. And of course, then finally, the remediability. So can these impacts or abuses be addressed? Scrolling up once again, going to the next tab. So the user guide is pretty much an FAQ page. Again, it goes into a lot of details prior to using the tool that would be important for those taking this sort of assessment. It talks about who the tool is good for. Once again, we talk about the definitions and what we give value to the terms that are referred to across the tool. Finally, it's important to just make note that the data gathered through this tool is just stored with us. It's aggregated data. We don't sort of go to the individual level, as well as email addresses that you use to generate the results are not stored with us. Moving on to the next tab. This looks at or details 6 areas of human rights risk. These are common to a lot of industries. So for example, if you look at labor rights, we've listed some key areas under this. So for example, terms of employment, wages and work hours. So just clicking on one of them, one of the areas, as you can see, it details what comes under each of these sections. And finally, it links to the relevant international human rights instruments, as well as the relevant SDG. Now I will just go to briefly demonstrating how you can go about using the tool. So if you click on the training tool logo, you can see here on the top right, you will be given a username and password to that. So I have logged in already. As you can see, there's a list of industries that you can pick from. So majority of them are covered here, but this will sort of be working on and adding on as time goes and as we develop this tool. So for the purpose of this example, I will pick agriculture. So you just have to select this and scroll down to the bottom and click the start button. Once you come to this page, you can see there are several questions that are listed out, of course, relevant to the sector that you pick. So as I have picked agriculture, the first one looks at the issue of part-time or seasonal work. How workers in this area are often subject to unequal protection, benefits, and working conditions. So when we scroll down, you can see there are several options that you need to rate. It's important to note that you should answer these questions based on the operating condition and country you are working in. So because I'm based in Sri Lanka and I work in Sri Lanka, I will sort of relate it back to that. So when we look at scale, so scale looks at the severity of the problem. And because we're looking at the agricultural sector, the seasonality of the type of work and the requirement for labor is not fixed. So the demand goes up and down depending on, the type of season and the operating months. So I would say because of that, we mark it as a high risk. Moving on to the next question, we look at scope. So here again, it looks at the number of people who are actually impacted by this area. So again, if I look at my country, Sri Lanka actually employs the highest number of workers in the agricultural sector. It's close to around 25%. So because of that, again, the numbers are fairly high. I would rate it somewhere here. So around that, leaning towards it, of course, being high. Looking at the remediability here again, so how is it addressed? How is this issue addressed? Looking at, again, my context, a lot of the farms and agricultural lands are owned by smallholder farmers or individuals, and larger, businesses working in this sector often engage with these stakeholders. It might be through sort of purchasing their products, but not directly with their workers. So when it comes to addressing, human rights risks of this nature, it is fairly challenging and requires, more intervention. So it's not very straightforward as it seems. So I would rate it somewhere here, more on the low side. Finally, looking at likelihood. So again, because this is the agriculture sector, it is sort of tied to the seasonality. The requirement, like as I mentioned, for jobs tends to go up and down. So the likelihood of this happening again is fairly high. So this is how you can go about answering the questions. Like I scroll down, there are other sort of questions or areas relevant to the sector. So for example, you can see here, this question talks about minimum age requirements. I will now just randomly select some options just to show you how the results will come out at the end. And scrolling down, you can see there are other questions. And once you answer it and scroll down to the bottom of the page, you click submit. And this is when you can see your results generated. So a heat map is generated for each of the questions that you answer. So as you can see, the first question that I answered looked at, part-time or seasonal work. You can see there's a description here, and also again, it links you to the relevant SDG. Very quickly explaining the heat map here, as you can see, it's categorized as a high risk. So all the squares in red belong to the high risk category. The middle orange bit is medium risk, and the yellow is low risk. So here, as you can see, because it's categorized at high risk, it gives businesses and those rolling out the tool how they can actually go about prioritizing these risks. So scrolling down, you can see the second option that I picked randomly. It is marked or categorized as low risk. So just like that, you will sort of get a heat map generated for each question. Finally, just want to make note that this is how businesses can go about prioritizing their risks. So high risks would be addressed first, and it's a good starting point for businesses to look at these areas and consider addressing these. And the medium and low risk can be addressed over time. So essentially, it's all about how you prioritize your risks, and these sort of results will help you and give you a good starting point. Finally, if you scroll down, you can see here, you can enter your email address and you can email the results to yourself, or you can sort of generate a PDF at the end and download it at that time in real life. Thank you. That's it from me. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Mianti, for that very comprehensive review of our human rights self-assessment tool. There we go. Coming back on to the main page. Thanks again, Mianti. And indeed, I also want to give a lot of credit to my colleague Anna Keller for working doggedly on this tool. They're much harder to put together than it seems. But Mianti and Anna have made it seem very easy indeed. We hope this easy to this straightforward tool can help you with the training process. Again, it's one of the many interactive features of the tool, and it should not be seen as taking the place of multi-stakeholder discussions on risks, but indeed, when done in a training context, it helps your audience better engage the material, scope, scale, immediability, and likelihood. Again, for identifying and prioritizing human rights is the first step of the 4-step process on human rights due diligence. Now, as we move along, I think we're here at the final stages, and we're right on time. We got about 10 minutes for questions, and I'm going to ask 3, and then perhaps if there's time after those questions, leave it to Livio Sarandrea for a closing remark. But he's graciously offered to skip him. Indeed, we do run out of time. But the first one, I think like first, bring it back to Malaysia. Start with Niloy. Niloy, someone from the audience asks, what can be done to prompt the Malaysian government to get serious about business and human rights? Is more foreign pressure required? What is required, in the opinion of this person, for the government to get more serious?
As we started, Sean, with the premise, look, there's no national consensus. I should point out that most labor abuse here is against migrant labor. So that's the starting point. And there's no national consensus on the treatment of migrants. This is the second sort of big challenge here. So there are extremely progressive ministers and ministries on this topic. For example, on the vaccine topic, From day one, Malaysian policymakers were clear that migrant labor would receive vaccines, whether or not they had an identity document. Yeah. So that's because it came from some very progressive ministries. But there are some other ministries, particularly the security ministries, that said, well, it's a security risk, etc. Anyway, that has gone through, not least because of the work of the UN with some parts of the government. But look, here's the deal. It's the nexus that has been built through work like the Business and Human Rights Initiative and of trade, which is essentially a foreign-facing activity, being linked to rights. As you said, those old days of trades and rights are two parallel universes, and never the twain shall meet. Those days are gone. So the narrative that has built up of trade being intricately linked to rights and increasingly to governance, to environmental governance, to environmental issues, is, I think, the leverage point here, because Malaysia relies on trade. No other country in this region other than Australia relies more on trade than Malaysia. So trade is a powerful, it doesn't have to be punitive. Heaven forbid, it shouldn't have to be punitive like the sanctions imposed by the US. It should just simply making the connection between trade and human rights should be good enough. The question is creating the political consensus. And businesses will need some support because, Sean, as you well know, Malaysia is nearly a developed country. The per capita income is just $1,500 short of Malaysia being classified a developed country. So wage costs here are not competitive unless you use cheap wage labor, which is migrant labor. So particularly SMEs and manufacturing will need to be, and plantations will need to be compensated somewhat for the higher costs of production until Malaysia can achieve a whole different production orbit. But until then, clearly trade is where the world has leverage, and it doesn't have to be through sanctions. It can be simply through the trade narrative, the link of trade and human rights. And no human rights, no trade. that is the carrot and stick way of putting it.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating. You're basically saying that the Malaysian, if I may put it, business model makes it tough to really break through the barrier of increasing protections on migrant labor. They are going to always be reliant on migrant labor, at least at this stage of development. They have to both break through perhaps, I don't want to overstate it, but a middle income trap problem, go up the value chain so that those costs in producing the items that they do currently don't keep them back. A fascinating response, Niloy. And again, thank you too for the reference for the policy challenges that Malaysia faces. It's not easy to simply adopt new legislation and assume all will be well. The implementation factor was also, the need for stronger implementation was also a theme that was brought up in some of our speakers' comments. And indeed, I'm hoping that you can speak more to that in the coming years, that we get beyond policy, get beyond, here's the new law, here's the new directive, and get really to, here is the implementation taking effect, and we're going to measure the effect, indeed, as Bruce is saying is happening in Africa with regards to conflict minerals. So thank you, Niloy. Another question with the remaining time we have goes to Amanda. A very simple question and similar to Niloy. So how do we encourage company leadership to take human rights due diligence? And this is a particularly important question. I've been talking to sustainability people in some big companies lately, just to get their views on a number of different things. And some of them tell me that it's a very lonely experience, especially the human rights advisors, a very lonely experience being a business human rights advisor at a big firm, because even if you do have buy-in rhetorically, the reality on a day-to-day basis is tough. So how do we encourage company leadership, but also how do we just encourage it across functions? how do we encourage uptake of human rights due diligence in these companies?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's what it's a similar experience I had as well throughout my career in sort of trying to get these issues at the forefront at the board level, to take them seriously and to take actual actions to implement real change within an organisation. It can often be a challenge, and part of that I think is driven by sort of cost imperatives, and there's the cost or perceived costs associated with compliance, additional levels of sort of regulatory compliance, things like that, which traditionally I think companies sort of didn't want to potentially engage with. I think now though what we're seeing is there's a broader movement, not just in the human rights, but we've touched on a bit before in sort of in terms of climate and ESG. So ESG as a broader topic. It's something which is driving, I think, behavioural change at a higher and deeper level than we've seen before, and I think it could be related to the focus on climate change impacts, and also the just transition, which I think one of the panelists mentioned as well. And I think what we are sometimes seeing is certain businesses are taking the lead. So some businesses are really stepping up, and then their competitors are sort of left to sort of either meet them there. So in effect, it's a kind of a race to the top, which is exactly the way I think we would like to see the direction of things going. And so by having that kind of competitive, I guess, edge, the businesses, certainly we see the major energy players now have spent a lot of time dealing. We certainly advise a lot of companies on at the board level on these sorts of risks. So I think that is going to drive up to a point where the senior leaders can't be ignoring these sorts of issues anymore. And I guess the final point, I guess, just to note is there are also moves to sort of tying in the sense of corporate duties and directors' duties to having to have considered these sorts of human rights issues. So it's kind of in the earlier stages, I think, in terms of litigation or bringing claims or potential criminal actions against directors who don't consider these risks. But I think that's potentially certainly something that's on the cards in the future. So I guess maybe, as Neela was saying, a bit of a carrot and stick approach as well.
Thank you, Amanda. So the competitive edge imperative of the risk, but also looking at ESG, because that is, as you said, driving very deeply the conversations on human rights, but also directors' duties and ensuring that at the board level these things be taken seriously. Thank you for those four points and others. I see that we got 60 seconds left, and this one is going to Ricardo. I really do want to bring it back to our partners at the EU, though. So Ricardo, this one's for you, and I know you've seen some proposed directives. I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure you've digested and given some thoughts on it. I'm not asking you to share too much, but this question is, perhaps you can answer this. What are the consequences that are envisioned for companies breaching non-complying with mandatory human rights due diligence, any legislation, and how is the EU planning to monitor and or sanction EU companies for not complying with any directive on mandatory human rights due diligence?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, given we're in the process and since considerations are ongoing, I mean, to be completely honest, we haven't finalized these positions yet. And even if we had finalized them internally, I wouldn't be able to communicate with you guys. I'm sorry. But I think if you want to kind of help to read the tea leaves, I think what Hus mentioned earlier, so the proposal that's coming up will cover the main aspects of identification, mitigation, prevention, as we all know. But the reporting aspect of it will be covered by this proposal that came out in April already. So if you can already find a link to the corporate social responsibility reporting directive, and in that directive you might get some indication of how enforcement and sanctions will work at the reporting stage, and you might be able to draw your own conclusions what will happen for the other parts.
Okay. Great. And any idea when the proposal will be made public? When will it land?
The last quarter of this year, so anytime between now and the end of the year.
Sufficiently vague.
I mean, there is no secret. There is a previous target date that was not public, that has been leaked. So if you read of Politico, you will all know that there was a previous target date of 27th of October.
Yeah.
So that's the date, but I think there is a possibility that it might slip further.
Okay.
It's important to get it right rather than get it done fast. Is our mantra. So, but yeah, at the end of that, it's hard to give any exact indications except between now and January.
Yeah, you know, if we had more time and if we knew each other better, perhaps I'd ask what's been doing everything. I'm sure it's much more contentious in the background than any of us can imagine, particularly as different EU countries are at different levels of economic health following COVID-19. This is a difficult period to start asking for companies to do more. But I just want to applaud you, Bruce, and others at the EU for staying the course and of course, and ensuring that those global standards get enforced in order to raise them everywhere, including here in Asia. We do need external pressure, as you've heard today. And at the same time, we also need patience as Quintet Tolan Council, and we need some a helping hand. Of course, Amanda is also experiencing that in her work every day at Clifford Chance. Look, everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I found this to be a very enriching discussion. I'm glad to have behind it tool, a product that we can share. The Human Rights Due Diligence Training Facilitation Guide is officially launched. And those of you who are trying to use the tool and finding the password, I think we're providing a temporary password for you so you can play around with the tool and see how it works. It's a temporary password because we'd like you to be in touch with us about your training with the tool at a later date. But be in touch with us on the email provided. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you very much to our panelists and everyone in the back of this making it happen. Take care, everyone.
ครับขอบคุณครับ
ขอบคุณมากครับ
ครับสวัสดีครับ